So welcome everyone to this evening's BMS Talk. Our chair for this evening is David Sartori. David is a mycologist with an interest in fungal taxonomy, ecology and conservation. So thank you very much, David, for chairing for us tonight, and over to you.
Great, thank you, Sally. So thanks for the introduction and welcome everyone to this month's BMS webinar. It's a real pleasure to be chairing tonight's talk with the brilliant Geoffrey Kibby, a man who I'm sure needs no introduction amongst the BMS community, but here's a bit more about him. So Geoffrey Kibby has studied fungi in Britain, Europe and America for nearly 60 years, is the senior editor of the BMS journal Field Mycology, a past president of the New Jersey Mycological Association, and the author of numerous field guides to the larger fungi, many of which are also illustrated by him. He has a particular interest in the genera Cortinarius, Amanita, and Russula. So the title of today's talk is How to Write Mushroom Guides When Everything Keeps Changing, Tackling the Impossible. So the talk will be followed by an opportunity for audience members to ask questions. And to do this, please use the chat window on Zoom, and I'll read out your questions afterwards at the end of the talk. So on that note, over to you, Geoffrey.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Sally. I'm going to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along to this meeting, and thank you for inviting me. So my talk is about writing books, which I've been doing for quite a long time. And I'm going to start my screen sharing. So hopefully you can see my desktop. And 1 second, share. Good. And then I call up this and we start that. So hopefully you can all see my screen. And I'm going to start my timer so I don't overrun. So I've been writing mushroom books for a long time. My first books, for those of you who have not seen any of my books, I've done several on independent genera, and then more recently I completed a 4-volume series on the mushrooms of Britain and Europe. My first book was back in, I think, 1979 for Oxford University Press, and in those days I used to write for publishers, and a little later on in the talk I'll be saying why I no longer do that. But that was my very first book. I was working at the Natural History Museum at the time, and then from then on I published several others before deciding to go independent. Over 2,000 years ago, Seneca, the Roman philosopher, said, "While we teach, we learn." And that's as true today as it ever was then. And certainly in the 10 years that it's taken me to write the 4-volume series, I've probably learned more in that 10 years than I have in the previous 50. I would encourage everyone who's got any interest in fungi to try writing something, whether it's an article or a key to fungi or a small pamphlet, because in the research that you do in order to write that leaflet or your book or whatever it is, you will learn an immense amount just in the research that you do. First of all, why write a book in the first place? What made me write the books? If we look at some of the popular field guides that are available at the moment, some of them are single volumes, some of them are multi-volume sets, some are relatively inexpensive, like the Roger Phillips book. Some of them are very expensive, like the Fungi of Switzerland 6-volume series. And you can see the numbers on the screen there. They're quite high, quite a large number of species in each volume. But all of those volumes include ascomycetes, the cup fungi. My 4 volumes do not. It's not a group I know very well, and I felt I couldn't really do them justice in those 4 volumes. So my 4 volumes are just basidiomycetes, what most people think of as mushrooms and toadstools, and include about 2,460 species illustrated, and there are quite a few more that are described or mentioned but are not illustrated. So in terms of numbers, I think I have more species of basidiomycetes than almost any other book currently in print. Should you use a publisher or self-publish? It's a difficult question, and there are pros and cons to both. Using a publisher, the pros are they do the design and layout of the book for you. They handle the distribution, which means they sell the books for you. And they take on the expense of production, which can be many thousands of pounds to print, especially hardback books. Cons, now you'll notice the first con is the same as the first pro. They do the design and layout of the book. So, and the reason for that is you may not like it. Their designers may have their own ideas of how to lay out the book and what number of species to include and so on. And although you have some input on that as an author, it's surprising how little you do have. Most publishers are not interested in specialist volumes. So, for example, if you decided you want to do a monograph on inocebi, for example, you probably would have quite a difficult job finding a publisher interested in producing such a volume. Most similar volumes you'll notice are published through universities or museums or similar institutions. Also, most publishers are not terribly willing to do updated editions. They're mostly producing a one-off volume, which they may keep in print for a year or two. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Roger Phillips' book, which is possibly the best-selling mushroom book ever. I worked closely with Roger on that book over about 3 years, and it sold tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of copies, was translated, I think, into 7 languages. But after we finished that book, we had thousands of pictures left over, photographs left over. And so Roger and I wanted to publish a second volume of rarer British fungi. And Pan publishers who were doing the book at that time were not interested. He tried and tried, but he could never get them to do a second volume. And that's from someone who is an absolute best-selling author. And finally, normally you get a one-off payment for specialist volumes. You don't normally get royalties. And although it may seem attractive when they offer you a few £1,000s, when they go on to sell hopefully thousands of copies, it's actually not very much. And also, a lot of publishers will then sell your book when they finish with it onto other publishers, and you do not get extra money for that. Self-publishing, the pros are you control the design and layout of the book. You can do what you want with it. You decide the basic price. You can update and produce new editions as you want. And of course, the profits, if there are any, are usually all yours. Cons is you have to do the design and layout of the book. And if you're not particularly computer savvy or don't have design skills, that may be a challenge. You may have to get somebody else to do that for you. You have to finance the printing, and it can be very expensive. Particularly my hardback volumes, you are talking in many, many thousands of pounds to do a print run of 1,000 copies, for example. And finally, actually one of the hardest things is you have to handle the packing and distribution. And if you get an order in for 200 books from some book dealer, it's you that has to box them up and ship them out, and that's quite hard work. The inspiration for my books were 2 main sources, in fact. One is quite an old book, Wakefield and Dennis, Common British Fungi, which I think was published back in the 60s, maybe, I can't remember the date. And in particular, the Collins Mushrooms and Toadstools Guide by Cortequise and Duhem. The latter is a good example of the, I call it short-sightedness of the publishers, because Collins have gone on to produce many mushroom guides, but in my opinion, none have been as good as the Cortequise and Duhem volume, and they've never reprinted it for reasons I cannot understand. The Wakefield and Dennis in particular was the inspiration for the layout of my books, and if I show you a close-up, you'll notice that on each page they have the microscopy on the page next to the species. So you see the faint outline drawings there of spores and some cystidia at the top. So I felt I wanted to do a book where everything was on the double page spread as you opened it. All of the text, all of the pictures, all of the microscopy was on that one page. I hate books where you have to turn the page to find something about the species, or worse still, go to the index to find out something. I like a book where everything is in front of you. So that was the principal inspiration for my design and layout of the books. The basics of book production, it's worth going into some detail, because if you ever consider writing even a pamphlet or a small book or a big book, you will come up against some of these problems. Desktop publishing software. Most desktop publishing software has got very expensive. I use Quark Express to do my volumes, but the edition of Quark that I have is the last edition that you could pay for and own yourself. They have now switched to a subscription system, which a lot of software publishers are doing, and it's very expensive. So if ever I change my computer, I'm going to have to switch from Quark, because it will no longer run on a new operating system. So if you're thinking of getting some desktop publishing software, I would certainly advise Affinity Publisher, which runs on all the systems, Windows, Mac, and so on. It's very inexpensive. You'll see it's £68 for the computer version, which, believe me, is inexpensive. Quark Express is several £100s, for example, and it's a one-off payment, no subscription, very slick, very stable. And they make versions for Windows, Mac, and iPad. And they also do versions which are equivalent to Photoshop and to Illustrator, so you can get the whole package for about £160. If you're going to print books, you will need a printing company. I use an Italian printers called PixArt, who are incredibly good, high quality printers. I would love to print with an English printers, and I've tried many. I cannot find any English printer that even comes close in terms of cost, in terms of speed. Quite often they're 2 or even 3 times more expensive, and certainly 2 to 3 times slower. With PixArt, I produce a PDF of the book. I send it off. Small books are on my doorstep in about a week. The large hardback volumes take about 2 weeks. So I can highly recommend them. There may be others out there, and if you know of a good English printer, I'm always happy to try, but as yet, I've never found one that matches in terms of price. You will need supplies, because if you're doing your self-publishing, you will need boxes and you will need packing materials. I use a company called DavPack. I'm sure there are dozens of others, but that's one I use, and you can have a look at them. And for everything else, packing tapes and so on, I use Viking Direct or even Amazon. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies, by the way. I wish I was. I'd be getting some money, but no, I'm not. If you are selling books, you will need to ship books not just to UK dealers, but overseas dealers as well. And rather than deal with UPS or DPD or DHL or any of these courier companies direct, it is actually more efficient to deal with a shipping agent. And I use interparcel.com, who are incredibly efficient. And the best part is that once you've told them how many boxes you're shipping and the weight of the boxes, which you do online, it gives you an instant quotation from all of the main couriers. So you can choose which one best suits you in terms of price or reliability and so on. And they also give you all of the labels and custom forms, etc. If you are going into book production and you intend to ship to book dealers, you will need an ISBN number. And the address you see there, the www address is nielsenisbnstore.com. That's where you have to go to get your ISBN numbers. They're not cheap. One number costs you £91. A block of 10, which is unique to you when you buy them, costs £174. And each number goes on each different book that you write. So these are all things that you would definitely need to invest in or explore should you come to write a book or want to start writing any sort of literature that you're going to sell. There are problems now following the disaster that is Brexit. Because we're now shipping to the EU, we're no longer a member of the EU. As an exporter, I have to have what's called an EORI number, an Economic Operators Registration and Identification Number. That means you're registered to sell overseas. and that's a government issued number, which you can see at the website there. It's actually very easy to do. There's a little form you fill in, and I think I had the number the same day or the latest the very next day. Be aware that everything takes much longer now when shipping to the EU, partly because it has to go through their customs, and it gets examined, and they also sit on it, I'm sure, for about a week. Books that would normally have taken me 3 days to reach Germany, for example, now take well over a week, sometimes 10 days. And be aware that your customers overseas often have to pay import duty because you're no longer in the EU. If you want to distribute your books in this country, I can thoroughly recommend the 3 UK dealers that I've got on screen there: Summerfield Books, Pemberley Books, and NHBS. If you Google their names, you'll see their catalogues. And they are by far, I think, the best online book dealers that have a specialist interest in fungal books. And they have a very large catalogue of such books, including my own. If you want to sell overseas, then I can recommend Myco Service, which is Andreas Gaminda. Many of you may know him. I've got several European dealers that I deal with, but he's by far the largest. So he's a good place to start if you're interested in selling your books overseas. Once you've got your book, or you've decided to write your book, then comes the knotty question of what names should you use? How cutting edge, how up to date should you be or not? And what names should you include? This is a very difficult problem. My starting point was this book, The Checklist of British and Irish Basidiomycota. I'm always surprised how many people don't know this book exists. This was published and worked on by the people at Kew, and it is still available as a hardback copy as far as I know, but you can also get a digital access to the book online at the address shown on the screen there. The reason for starting with this as a checklist, not any of the other databases that are out there, firstly, it only recorded species with actual specimens. So specimens that were in the fungarium at Kew, or in the fungarium at Edinburgh, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Edinburgh, or similar. So if there was no specimen, no record, it was not included as British. And to my mind, that is the only real way to go, because otherwise you've just got a name on a piece of paper and you can't prove whether it was correct or not. By using herbarium-based database, at some point someone could go back and check on specimens to see if you were correct. So this was my basis for my books. At the time of publication, this volume included 3,760 species, but they've gone on in the years since then to publish 11 online updates. So the total is now well over 4,000 species. And if you remember right at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned I published, my 4 volumes have about 2,500 species. So I'm still quite well short of the number of species that are known in Britain. So I could even do another book if I wanted to. If you go to that website, this is what you'll see. There are the 11 updates, and you can download them as individual PDFs. There are also 2 very useful compendiums, volume parts 1 to 6 and parts 7 to 11. When you download one of those updates, this is what you will see. This is a page from one of those updates. And in case your screen is too small to read that writing, here's a close-up of just 3 of the updates. And why the checklist is so useful and so important, not only does it give you the most up-to-date name possible, it will tell you what country it comes from, E for England, for example, the habitat, and then details of the collection, often including whether it was sequenced and who sequenced it, and whether there are sequences in Kew and so on. So it's an invaluable resource. Anyone recording fungi, whether you're intending to write books or reports or anything, should frankly have a copy of this on their computer. So I encourage you to either buy the hard copy or download the updates and access to digital copy online. New species. There are 91 species added to the British list as far as Kew is concerned in the year 2022, last year. Just think about that for a moment. Nearly 100 species were added last year, and the trend is continuing. New species are going on every year. My colleague Alec Henrici calculated that over the last 15 years, on average, a new species is added to the British list every 2 weeks. So what that meant for me as an author is that the instant my books were published, they were out of date. And of course, that's the same for any book that tries to cover fungi or indeed any organism. As soon as you publish it, it's probably going to be out of date. Names may change, new species may be added. Of those 91 new records in 2022, 78 were supported via DNA sequencing. And I'm sure most of you are aware that DNA is the next big thing. You cannot do anything in mushrooming these days without coming up against sequencing, and almost every new species described these days is supported by DNA. And certainly if I find something I think is new or rare, I will attempt to get it sequenced. And I know many of the fungal clubs around Britain now have their own bento boxes to do their own DNA extraction and are then sending them off to get sequenced. So we've entered a new age of accuracy, if you like, in identification of fungi. And certainly I try to keep that in mind when writing my books, to do as much research into the species as possible to make sure I had the very latest information. Should extralimital species, i.e. non-British, be included in any book? Absolutely. The number of new species, including my book, quite a few of them, have been recorded since their publication. For example, I don't know if Pauline is online at the moment, but she has already found 2 of my species that I put in and using my books. So that's very gratifying. And some others have been found since by other people. So in a way, I wish I'd included even more species that are not yet British, because inevitably with things like global warming, for example, we are getting more Mediterranean species coming in, for example. And I have to confess, although I swore to myself I would not go beyond 4 volumes, I am now thinking about doing a volume 5, including a number of British species that have been added since I finished those 4, and possibly including more species that I anticipate being found in this country. Now we come to this sticky problem of what name do we use? And I thought long and hard about this when I started my books. Do I use names that are familiar to most people, or do I try and be cutting edge and use the very latest taxonomy, the most up-to-date name possible? And in the end, I decided to go with the latter decision. I felt it was a disservice to use names that were no longer current. But then, having decided that, where do I find the correct name? There are 2 principal databases which most of us use. One is Index Fungorum, the other is Species Fungorum. Both of these are put together by one person, which is Paul Kirk, who has this mammoth task of essentially indexing every fungal name published. Now, the first one, Index Fungorum, Paul is always at great pains to stress, is not a taxonomic database. It's a nomenclatural database, which is to say it's concerned with names. It's concerned with finding which is the most recent, accurate, and correctly published name for a species, and then thereafter assigning any synonyms and so on. It doesn't particularly concern itself with whether the taxonomy is correct. That is done in the accompanying database, Species Fungorum, where he does attempt to give a more taxonomic assessment of any particular species. But we have to remember that Paul is only one man. He's not an expert in everything. He tries to keep up with all of the published literature, but inevitably he falls behind on some things, and very often he may not be an expert in a particular group. Should we follow either of these? Well, it depends partly on the species group you're working on, how up to date you think the database is, and of course if you agree with the taxonomy and the nomenclature that's being used in those databases. Sometimes I did, most of the time I did, occasionally I did not. I often followed the latest paper or book that I could come across or download. For example, Matthew Nordelus just published his wonderful new book on entelomas, and in many cases the new names differed from those currently in use on Index Fungal or Species Fungal, mostly because Paul hadn't had a chance to catch up and change names and so on. So I chose to follow the enteloma monograph rather than what was on Index Fungorum. You don't have to follow any of these names, of course. I'm old enough to remember when Lexinum, for example, was still Boletus. And after Boletus, very briefly, Lexinums were called Cromholtziella. That lasted for a couple of years before they became Lexinum. And now Lexinum itself has been split. We now have Lexinum and Lexinellum, for example. You can choose to follow that. You could choose to still call them Boletus. It depends where you like to split your big genera. Some people like big genera with smaller groupings within a genus. Some people like smaller groups to have their own generic name. And there are very good groups on Facebook. There's an advanced mushroom taxonomic group on Facebook, which is worth logging into, where you'll see many of these discussions taking place about names and species and generic names and so on. So I'd recommend you go onto that group on Facebook, where you'll see the experts arguing their cases on exactly this problem of what names should we be using. If you're going to do a book or a pamphlet, should we use photos or illustrations? I've used both in various books that I've produced, and both have their advantages. The problem with photographs is that all too often specimens in the wild, when you come across them, look a bit like this, rather sad, a bit past their sell-by date. They've been chewed by slugs or small mammals, or someone's kicked them over, or you find one specimen on its own and you'd like a group and so on. It's not often you find the perfect group of a fungus. And for many species, you may never find a specimen to photograph. There are still many species of fungi I have never personally seen, let alone be lucky enough to get a photograph of. So for example, if I go back to the Enteloma genii that I showed you the picture of before, this was a species I included in my last volume. And at that point, it was only known from Ireland until Pauline Penner found specimens, which you see illustrated on the left, down in Cornwall. And she has now gone on to assess lots of other collections from that area, and she thinks it may be quite widespread on the sort of western counties. So here it's actually better for me to illustrate it. I couldn't find a photograph. I managed to find a description and a small photograph of the original collection. So that was quite useful to me. I was able to paint a picture based on that description. And of course, I was then able to include descriptions of its microscopy, as you can see on that page. So one of the advantages of illustrations is you can illustrate things you have never personally found. And you can include microscopy, and of course you can illustrate it in perfect condition, minus slug holes and rabbit chews and so on. So for example, looking at Enteloma still, on the left you see a photograph of Enteloma atromatidum. I have seen atromatidum, and that's my photograph of it. I've seen Bloxamii once. I've never seen Luteobasis. I've certainly never seen the pink form that can occur of both. I've never seen Madidum, but I have seen Nitidum, but so long ago it was before I was doing photography at all. So illustration allowed me to paint many species that I'd never come across and certainly never photographed. And I would say that illustrating a fungus is one of the best ways to learn and remember its features, because you spend quite a lot of time doing the illustration or drawing, and it's a really good way to hone in on its features and learn what those particular characters are. If you're going to produce illustrations yourself, then you will need to do them in some fashion, or pay somebody else to do it for you. Now, when I did my volume 1, I did that in the traditional method using colour pencils for the most part, with some additional watercolours. And volume 1 took me 3 years to do. The problem is, I love painting. It's one of the things I do. I love doing it. But once you've painted your picture, you have to scan the image and on a flatbed scanner, and that introduces some problems immediately. Flatbed scanners inevitably change the color slightly. However good your calibration of your system is, there will be some shift in the color system, in the color of the picture. And also the flatbed scanner is so accurate, because you're scanning at quite high resolution, that it will pick up imperfections in the paper itself. So I then had to open the scan in Photoshop, and I had to very carefully erase the background around the mushrooms to isolate the fungus. Once that's done, I had to then import it from Photoshop onto the desktop publishing software, and probably do some more color correcting again. So when I came to do volume 2, by that point I'd purchased an Apple iPad, and I downloaded this software called Procreate. And those subsequent volumes, volumes 2, 3, and 4, took about a year, maybe a year and a quarter each, using the Apple iPad. The difference is that the color on the iPad screen is exactly what goes onto the desktop publishing software. Within seconds of finishing the painting, I would just press a button that says share, and it would jump across to my computer. In another second, it will be inside my desktop publishing package on the page, which is Quark Express at this point. It also allows me to do things I could not do with traditional illustration. For example, I'll let you into a little secret. If you look at the bottom right picture, which is a Campanella species, those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 caps are actually all the same drawing. I actually only painted 1 cap, but in Procreate I can warp and distort and twist and reshape specimens and rejoin them together. So it saved me the time of having to paint 6 different caps. So I've painted 1 cap, I've changed their shape, changed their position, reassembled them to make a bunch of caps. So a little digital tip there on how to save yourself time. If you look at the picture on the middle left, the little white mycena with the droplets all over it, that would have been extremely difficult to produce with traditional media. But because I could use a black background in Procreate, it was extremely simple to do the bubbles and the droplets of liquid on the cap. The other thing I discovered, and which you've discovered too, is that you don't have to draw such high resolution pictures digitally, because they're going to be shrunk on average on my books. Each picture is maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches in height. So it's a much quicker system. I would advise everyone to get the Apple iPad. And I can't resist showing you this. The Procreate software, which I would thoroughly recommend, is incredibly cheap, $12.99. And it's completely free. All the updates are free. And from my personal experience, I've tried almost every illustration package you can get on the iPad. Procreate is still the most intuitive, slick, easy to use software. Anyone can learn to use it in half an hour to an hour, I would say. It doesn't run on anything except Apple iPads, I'm I'm afraid. So you will have to commit to purchasing an iPad. But I'm just going to show you a little video, which is a speedy up video of how I draw that picture, for example. So this would have taken probably a couple of hours in real life. It's a speeded up drawing of the actual process. And you see, I'll start with fairly basic colors. And in a moment, you'll see that the cap changes shape. And again, I couldn't do that with traditional media. And there, I warped the cap and it will change shape again because I wasn't, and it changed right there. So one of the advantages of a digital illustration is you can alter it, you can correct it, you can change it, you can play around with it to your heart's content, which is very difficult to do with, say, a pencil drawing or a watercolor drawing. If I make a mistake in a watercolor drawing or a pencil, it's there for good. You really normally have to start again. A mistake done digitally allows you to go in and correct to your heart's content. So if any of you are artists or feel you can do some illustration, I would thoroughly recommend investigating Apple iPads and Procreate. Apart from doing watercolor type drawings, they also have pencils and pen illustration included, so you can do line drawings, which is how I did the drawings of spores and cystidia and so on. So I think that's the screen part of my talk. So I'm going to stop the share and go back, I hope, to, let me just see if that worked, and escape out of that and go back to here. So hopefully you can now see me back on screen. And I think I finished early, in fact. So I am open to any questions. If anyone's got any questions about publishing or drawing or any aspect of book production, fire away.
Great. Thank you so much, Geoffrey, for the thoughtful and engaging talk. So whilst I wait for the questions to roll in, I do have a question that I'd like to pick up on. You did mention halfway through your talk that there's an advanced fungal taxonomy Facebook group. Do you happen to know the name of that one that I can share with the rest of the audience?
Off the top of my head, I know it starts with the word advanced mushroom. I'd have to look it up, to be honest. I can do that on my phone while you're talking. I will try and do that.
No worries. We can come back to that as well.
Okay.
All right. So first question we have today is from Jane. She says, if species are spreading from abroad, could this be a threat to the environment?
It's a good question. I mean, some of our commonest invading species are the ones that grow on wood chips and garden mulch. And inevitably, they've come in presumably on foreign timbers, possibly on people's shoes, for all I know. But numerous invading species in the last 10, 15 years have appeared on wood chips, and some of them certainly have pushed out other species that used to grow on wood chips. Genus Agricybia is a good example of that. In Kew, where all the flower beds in Kew are mulched with wood chips, the common Agricybia used to be Agricybia putaminum, which itself was an invader. But in recent years, that's been pushed out by other invading species, such as Stropharia aurantiaca, now called Liratiomyces series, and so on. So even the invaders can get pushed out by other invaders. Whether they're a threat to the environment, I don't think anyone really knows, to be honest. The question has been raised. A lot of people now are cultivating mushrooms, like foreign mushrooms, hericiums, the hedgehog fungi, for example. But often the strains that are being cultivated are being brought in from overseas. We don't really know what will happen if those spores escape into the wild. Will they compete with their own native populations? I don't know. There are people probably better placed than me to answer those questions. But it is certainly a topic for serious consideration.
Great, thank you.
David, I've got the answer to your first question. The Facebook group is called the Advanced Mushroom Identification and Discussion.
Great, thank you. So the Advanced Mushroom Identification
and Discussion.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so moving on to the next questions, you have a lot of compliments on your drawings as well, which I also reflect on that. They are fantastic as well. We have a question about potentially making an exhibition. Has that ever been on the works for you?
Well, yeah, certainly for volume 1, I have all the paintings for volume 1. They're all on small cards about yay big. Each species was on a card. So I've got a stack literally probably a foot tall of paintings from my first volume. Of course, the subsequent volumes I've only got digitally. They could be printed, of course, I suppose, but if there was an exhibition, it would probably be just the pictures from volume 1.
Great. Now, you haven't mentioned kind of the promotional aspect of publishing books. Linda asks, how do you get the word around?
Facebook is probably the best thing since sliced bread for stuff like that. Because if you put something on, say, the BMS page, and if people don't know the BMS Facebook page, they should. It's a fabulous site to go on to. But Facebook has, I can't remember how many thousand members on it already. And that's just one of a number of Facebook mushroom groups, many of which have thousands of members. So if you put something on one, often people share it, and pretty soon your little bit of publicity has gone around thousands of people. Also, if you sell your books or promote your books through online book dealers, they of course have their own distribution lists, so they will go around the world. And once you put an ISBN number on your book, then that immediately becomes available to all booksellers all around the world, who then, anyone that's interested in selling mushroom books will come across your ISBN number and see the title of your new book. So your potential audience is huge.
Great, and it seems it's paying off because we have a question also saying, any plans for a North American field guide?
I've done a North American field guide many years ago. If you just wait 1 second, I've got it here somewhere. There we go. That's not the one. Where is it? Here. There we go. Many more years ago than I care to remember, I did mushrooms and other fungi of North America. Similar style paintings and so on. Out of print, long time. Probably still available secondhand somewhere, I guess. But at the moment, no, not to do. I used to know a lot about American mushrooms, but I've probably forgotten everything I knew. I've been away from America now for nearly 30 years. So plus mushroom taxonomy has moved on a lot in North America.
Great. And perhaps this next one is a bit contentious, but what are your thoughts on putting books up online? And do you have any intent of doing that yourself for your books?
I don't. The big problem is, one, I don't think you can make money on them. And obviously one of my motives for writing books is to make some money. It supplements my income. So number one is I don't think it's possible to make a great profit on online books. And once you do an online book, it's very difficult to stop it being shared. Sooner or later, it gets distributed and suddenly you find it turns up in all over the world and you haven't got any control over where your book is going. And then suddenly pictures from your book are being extracted and they appear on Google or somewhere. I've already seen paintings of mine on websites without my permission. So that is so no, I have no intention at the moment of doing, say, online PDFs.
Thank you. All right, next question from Eric. Your recent books don't include keys. I can understand why, but how do you see the fragmentation of genera affecting key writers?
Quite frankly, it's a nightmare. I'm working on a key to Russula at the moment, and that's just one genus. That's hard enough. The problem is it's quite easy actually to make a key to species. It's much harder to do a key to genera, because many of the modern genera are based almost entirely on DNA. A genus is split off from another genus because the DNA shows it's quite separate. But finding morphological characters that are easy to use in a key can often be extremely difficult. It was much easier 20 years ago, frankly, when genera were much larger and far fewer than they are today. So yeah, it is extremely difficult, which is one of the reasons why I didn't do keys. Plus, it would have added hundreds of pages to each book, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Great. So next question we have from David. Having learnt predominantly from books and online, it's really interesting to hear the different pronunciations of the species and genera that you use. Would you ever consider putting suggested pronunciations in your books?
Ooh, good question. There are already, I've certainly seen online some websites on pronunciation, particularly in America. Americans are very fond of producing pronunciation guides for fungi, and there are some very good ones over there. There may be some British ones I'm not aware of. I hadn't thought of it, but that's certainly something to toy with for future publications. But for those who are interested in that, there are some good online ones. I'm sure if you Google how to pronounce mushroom names, you'll find some resources for that purpose. We tend to follow the sort of strict Latin, but to be honest, we don't really know how they pronounce them. And whether you say Amanita or Amanita or Russula or Rusula, as the Americans seem to like to say, choice is yours, frankly. No one's going to shoot you if you pronounce a name differently.
Great. So next question we have, the Isle of Man is writing/publishing a checklist of the fungi found on the island, including the 320 new species since our group was formed. Have you any advice on producing checklists?
Oh, fantastic. Good. Definitely start with the Basidium mycota checklist I showed you. Compare your checklist with them because they're using the most up-to-date names, the most up-to-date taxonomy. You can compare your checklist with theirs and see if you're using, first of all, the best name. And maybe your species, you may find your species have been synonymized, or you may find a species that you found has now been split into 2 or 3 species. So it may encourage you to then investigate it further. And then obviously use things like Index Fungorum to check correct author citations and so on, because that's also important. And you might also want to consider, because common names are so popular now, even though I didn't use them, common names are very popular. You might want to include common names with your alongside your database.
Great. So this next question is kind of tying it back to the first one that we've seen today. So the question is, spores carried on shoes has introduced problematic pathogens. Are laws ever likely to be tightened around this?
Ooh, good question. I suspect not, except in case, when you get things like foot and mouth disease and so on, and you had to go through disinfectant washes with your boots and so on. For fungi, I think it's probably too late, and I think it will be impossible to stop, frankly. But I do suspect that quite a few fungi are spread on things like feet, on shoes. I think it's inevitable. If you tramp through the forest, you probably pick up spores on your shoes. And if you then go to another forest, you could well transmit those spores somewhere else. I don't have any research on that, but it seems to me quite possible. But to legislate against it, I think, would be almost impossible.
Great. So the next 2 questions are very closely intertwined with each other. So Peter asks, which is best, real life illustrations as per slug-eaten photos, or an imaginary perfect mushroom? And then also the next question is, why did you prefer drawings over photos?
Oh, well, okay, I'll do that in 2 parts. Yes, I prefer to draw an actual mushroom. No question. In fact, the very last mushroom I showed you, the one with the speeded up video, was drawn from life. And you can probably tell by looking at that picture, it's much more accurate, it's much more detailed. Drawing from a photograph is never as good, but quite often that was the only choice I had. With 2,500 mushrooms, I've photographed quite a lot, but I've certainly not photographed 2,500. And quite often when I'm doing a book, the very mushroom you want to illustrate vanishes from sight. It's one of those laws, that the thing you want to find disappears from the woodlands for some reason. So I was forced to draw from photographs. It's never as good, but you make do with what you can. I do like to draw. I've always been an artist since I was 5 years old, but I also love to photograph. But it was a question of time and effort. I knew I would never get enough photographs to illustrate the 4 volumes. So if I was going to do 2,500 mushrooms, the only recourse I had was to produce paintings. It was simply a matter of logistics, really, of doing it and it took 10 years to do the 4 volumes. So it would have taken much, much longer if I waited to get photographs of everything.
Great, thank you. So we're going to be veering off into slightly philosophical terrain now. So a question from Roy, who says, are we losing morphological skills for identifying fungi in the realm of molecular biology? And I'm going to follow this up with another one afterwards, but I'll let you answer that one first.
I would say yes to that, to be honest. I always look back at some of these early authors, the sort of Victorians and post-Victorian authors, early 1900s, people like Carlton Ree, and in more recent times, Peter Orton, Pearson, and so on, who were master field mycologists. If you look at Peter Orton, so many of his species still survive today, which were based purely on field mycology and have since been proven by sequencing. He lost a few, admittedly. Quite a few of his species got sunk following DNA, but on the whole, he was an amazing field mycologist. And if you look back at some of these Victorian mycologists, incredibly good field mycologists. I always say mycology is an art as well as a science. It's the art of noticing minutiae, being able to look at a specimen in minute detail and noticing when something is, oops, that's my alarm telling me my time has stopped. There we go. It's in noticing the minutiae of a fungus. Does it have a veil? Does the veil have lines on it? Are there fragments of veil on the edge of the cap, and so on? Did the flesh change color at the base of the stem when you handled it? All these tiny details which help you home in on whether you've got a particular species or not. Now, inevitably, with some species, morphology is not enough. We now know that. For some, particularly in some species groups, morphology can only take you so far, and you know it's in such and such a group of maybe 2 or 3 species, but to be absolutely sure, you probably will have to resort to DNA. But to get to that point in the first place, you do need good field skills. So absolutely, I think field mycology and the art of observation, is as important, if not more so than ever, because quite often what DNA tells us is we've got 3 species instead of 1, for example. But what it won't tell us is how to distinguish species A from B from C. It'll tell us they're different, but it can't tell us how they differ in the field. And for that, we have to rely on us. And that may be observing minute characters of the mushroom, it may be observing characters of the habitat or the ecology. And for that, we still need the human element, the observational element. DNA can't do that for us. It can tell us what we have, but it can't tell you how to separate them visually.
Absolutely. So just going to ask a question from myself here for a second. So from the early days of fungal taxonomy through to today, it seems that the technical skills that are expected of field mycologists has steadily widened over time. So what started off as, field observations expanded to make use of microscopy as an essential component of field mycology. And now today we're seeing DNA barcoding becoming increasingly seen as an essential tool for fungal identification. So what do you think the skill set will be of future field mycologists kind of moving into the study? Will there be a separation between the field mycologist and the molecular biologist, or do you see a kind of hybridization of the two happening?
I hope there won't be a separation. In fact, I think we're seeing the case that it's not, because I think I mentioned earlier in the talk, many local groups now, many of the local mushroom groups around the country have purchased bento boxes, these little DNA extraction kits, essentially, and they're combining their field studies, their collections and their expertise, and they've usually got one or two people who are keen on going that bit further and are doing the extraction. So it's not beyond any group of people to start doing, for example, DNA work. Inevitably, some people won't want to do that. Some people won't want to do microscopy, for example. They just want to go out in the field and enjoy the experience of looking at fungi, collecting fungi, maybe eating fungi. And that may be as far as they want to go, and that's perfectly valid. Nothing wrong with that at all. You just have to be aware that for a lot of species, to go beyond a certain point, you'll certainly need microscopy. That would be step number one. To go beyond that point for some species, not for all, you may need to go the route of getting DNA sequencing. But that, more and more people are doing that, and it's not beyond anyone's capabilities, either singly or maybe as a group. If you feel it's not in your ability to do that yourself, then that's why you should join a local mushroom group or join the BMS, because you'll have people there who maybe have got more experience than you. Certainly you'll have, say, experience in microscopy, and in some cases now have experience in DNA extraction and how to get those sequenced and so on. So I think the future is quite rosy, frankly. I think we're going to see more and more mushroom groups investing in this sort of technology, and discovering stuff for themselves. And many groups, I must call out Eric Yanker, for example, who down in the Hampshire group, who has been doing lots of sequencing over the last couple of years, and has probably single-handedly, along with his group, added, I don't know how many, God knows how many new species to the British list, certainly 20 or more, I should think. If he's online, he may well correct me on that, but he's added a lot. And that's just, one local group, county group, who've managed to get someone who's very keen on doing all that work and has produced amazing results. And other groups around the country are doing similar things.
Yeah, so Eric is here with us as well today. So,
Hi, Eric.
So, next question we have, what's the process that you have when balancing the time spent drawing versus the time spent actually researching and writing about your fungi? Kind of what is the split between the two tasks?
Good question. I would say for every hour that I either paint a picture or type out its description, there can be anywhere from 5 to 10 hours of research. I mean, to produce volume 3, for example, or 2, 3, and 4, they took about a year and a bit each. But I would say only about 3 months of that was probably doing the pictures. Because I can do a mushroom picture on an iPad now in about 20 minutes, sometimes quicker. It's not a long process. Doing the research to try and find out what name to use, what is the correct taxonomy, finding a description in the first place. Some of these pieces are quite obscure, and tracking down a publication with those descriptions can take a lot of time. I'm in a fortunate position, being an associate researcher at Kew. I've got access to their libraries and so on, which I know many people won't have. But yeah, for every hour I spent actually working on the book, you could certainly have 5 to 10 hours doing research. It's if you want a stress-free life, don't go into publishing, because it can be stressful. It can take a lot of time. But if you want an interesting life, you want to learn more than you've ever known about fungi, then definitely try and write a book or a pamphlet or anything.
So, as someone who I've got all of your books, and the quality of the printing and the images and the text is really, really good. It's very sharp and it's good to hold in the hand. And I'm one of the people who likes to keep books in pristine condition. So we have a question as well from Vaughan, who says, any chance of producing a new field guide? They would dread taking your new books out and about. And I definitely have to, agree with that.
So just to repeat that, what is he asking exactly?
Any chance of a new field guide anytime soon? So I guess a book that you can take out, dogged
Oh,
corners
maybe a
and
more generalized. I had thought at one point of doing, because I've got 4 volumes, at one point I thought putting all 4 into one volume, but that would be too big, I think, too heavy. I have done small field guides. In fact, one of them is still in print. I'd have to think about what it's called. I have done small generalized field guides. It's published by Phillips Press, and that definitely is still in print, I think. I haven't thought about doing another one, but always a possibility. I'm toying with doing, well, I am working on a huge book on Russula at the moment, which will take a couple of years yet to do, 500 pages plus, A4 photographs. And I'm toying with doing a book on Scottish fungi, because I love Scotland and I've been going for years now, and I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs. So I'm thinking of doing a book just on fungi of the Cairngorms or Scotland in general. So I've also thought of doing a children's book of fungi as well, aimed at encouraging kids to go out and look at mushrooms and little projects they can do with fungi. So if I have a second life, I may do them all, but I'll try and do as many as I can in my time.
fantastic. And I'm sure everyone in Scotland right now who's watching is collectively applauding and cheering you on for that decision. Elephant in the room next up. Are you also going to work with ascomycetes at any point?
Ooh, well, I think I said earlier in the talk, I sort of swore to myself when I finished volume 4, because it was such a slog, 10 years. It was 10 continuous non-stop years from volume 1 to volume 4. So that's quite a long time. And I sort of swore to myself, that's it. That's the series. It's all finished. But I am toying with doing a volume 5, partly, as I said, to include a lot of new species that have been added to the British list, more extralimital species. And I had thought maybe I should do some of the larger ascomycetes. I'm not an asco person. I don't do little tiny cup fungi blobs on wood, but certainly the big ones, morels and hovellas and some of the larger cup fungi and so on, I could certainly include quite a lot of those. So I have sort of considered that, and I think it's quite likely that I will be starting a volume 5 fairly soon. So watch this space, I think, is the phrase.
Cool. So next question is, should common names have initial capitals?
Common names?
Mm-hmm.
I think they should, because I think a name is a name. If you had Robert Smith, for example, they're capitalized. So my rule of thumb is, if I said oak, as in oak trees, that would be lowercase, because there's lots of oaks, species of oaks. If I specifically said the turkey oak, then I would have the T in capitals, because that's a name of a specific oak. If I said field bluet, that is one particular mushroom. There is no other field bluet. So that would both be capitalized, capital F, capital B. So that's my sort of hard and fast rule for common names. So if it's a generalized name, so if I said morel, for example, that would be lowercase, because there were lots of different species of morel. If I had a specific morel, then I would capitalize. And if it was a unique fungus like wood bluet or field bluet, I would capitalize both words. Other people may have their own schemes, but that's what sort of works for me.
Thank you. So next up, I have a question as well, more geared towards people who are just starting out with identification and field mycology, and that is, depending on what type of guide the person might be using, whether it's more of a field guide that they take out with them into the woods, or perhaps a more specialist text, what is your recommended approach for getting down to a species? Would it be more of a kind of flick and snap approach where you simply see something that looks similar and then investigate further? Would you prefer a more methodological approach of using a key and getting it down step by step that way? What would your advice be on someone
Very
who's
good
just
question.
learning?
I'm sure the people at Kew won't want me to tell you this, but very often the first thing they do is open a book and flick through the pictures. Often my books, I'm proud to say. And it's something we all do, frankly, because quite often when you find something, you may remember you've seen something similar. You might not remember what it is, but you think, oh, I've seen that before. So quite often the quickest way to find something is to flick through the pictures. If that fails and you can't narrow it down, there are some good keys out there. Fungi of Temperate Europe, I think I showed the volume right at almost my first slide. This 2-volume set is an incredible resource. They've got very, very good keys to genera and then hopefully down to species. So that would certainly be a good place to start. There are some good online resources available to you. A lot of guides don't have keys purely because they take so much space in a book. But certainly when I find something and I don't know what it is, my first sort of course of action is to flick through the pictures, quite frankly. I often have a rough guide. If you can get it down to genus, or at least the group of fungi, so you might know you've got a bolete, for example, then try and go to the bolete section of your favorite mushroom guide, try and see what genus you're in. Maybe you've got a Lexinum, or you've got a Boletus proper, and so on, and then hopefully get down to the correct species. Now, it may be that your book doesn't have all the species. One of the impetuses for me to write my books was I got annoyed that the species I found were often not in the books that I had. So I wanted to write as comprehensive a set of books as possible. So you have to be prepared for the fact that what you find may not be in the books. I remember when I started out, and I know many mycologists will agree with this, the tendency is to try and force your mushroom to fit a description in a book. You can't believe that you might have something that's not in the book, or may even be, heaven forbid, rare, or even new to Britain. But it's actually quite easy to find something that's rare. It's not actually that difficult to find a species new to Britain these days, as we learn more and more about fungi. But it's a tricky question. You can never have enough books. Every mycologist will tell you the same thing. You start off small, you buy your small field guide, you then get another book that's got 20 more species or 100 more species. You can never have enough books, because some book may have a better photograph than another one may have a better illustration. Buy as many books as you can afford. Go online, look at Google references, look at good online mushroom references. It's a difficult science, make no mistake. Mushrooming is not an easy science, but if you persevere, you will get there.
Okay, so thanks for that. Next question we have is, so just to kind of have a bit of a preamble, some mycologists eke out a career specializing in one specific group and, go very deep on one group. Other people prefer to be more generalized and kind of sweep across a broad taxonomic range. Do you have a favorite group of fungi? And if so, which one?
My two favorite groups, well, three, I should say. I've always loved bollies. I think most mycologists, when they start out, are attracted to bollies because they're big, they're showy, often edible, which is quite nice, and they've got amazing colours. And we don't have very many in Britain. We have, I can't remember what the total is now, but somewhere around 100, maybe a bit above that. So it's a manageable group. They are, for the most part, entirely identifiable on field characters. There are a few that are trickier, but for the most part, you can identify 90% of British boletes purely on field characters. So they're a fantastic group for anyone to start with if you want to get into a particular group. I would highly recommend boletes. And they start in early summer, they go throughout the year, and there's a whole succession of species starting in summer. So that would be my first group of choice, and they still remain today one of my favorite groups. My second group is a group that most people hate, which is Cortinarius. This stems from when I worked with Roger Phillips on his book, and we kept finding hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Cortinarius, most of which didn't make it into his book. And he and I always intended to do a book together, and sadly that never took place. We realized we just didn't know enough. And I was very sorry that he died just before the book that myself and Mario Tortelli produced on Cortinarius came out, because he would have been thrilled to have seen that result of our long studies over the years. So I have a soft spot for Cortinarius. They're always going to be an incredibly difficult group, but they are beautiful. And it is possible to identify quite a lot. So that's a group I love, and I've done a book on them with Mario. My other big favorite group, and since I was about 16 probably, is the genus Russula. And this goes back to teachers. There's a long-standing thing that some of your biggest influences in life are your early teachers. And what got me into Russula is the very first BMS foray I went on, in fact, when I was probably 16 or 17, with Ronnie Rayner, the late Ronnie Rayner, who was a mushroom specialist and produced a nice little BMS guide on Russulas. And he took us around, and I remember to this day, he picked up a Russula and he broke the base of the stem and said, "Smell this, it smells of iodine." And that was it. That was that one trigger. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing. He had this purple cap Russula and it smelt of iodine. And that one event was what triggered my lifelong love of the genus Russula. It's a big genus, it's a difficult genus. We have 156 species to date in Britain. But I still love them, even though they are incredibly frustrating and incredibly difficult to identify in many cases. And then Amanita, I have a soft spot for those. But at the moment, we just don't know enough about Amanitas. They are, again, incredibly difficult. So 4 groups, four.
Wow. Okay, Geoffrey. So that was a wonderful session, and I wish we could continue the conversation further, but we're going to wrap it up for tonight. So I'd like to say a massive thank you for sharing your work with us tonight and the massive contributions that you've made to mycology in Britain and beyond. I'd also like to thank Sally Hawkes at the BMS office for helping to coordinate the event and the logistics. And finally, a massive, massive thank you to the audience who made it a very engaging conversation afterwards. So thank you for joining us tonight, and yeah, take care, everyone.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks everybody for coming in. I saw many familiar names there. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks again. Take care.
Right.
Bye now.
Thank you.